Okay, let's start. I'm sure people will continue to drift in, but got to start sometime. So I'm Nick Evans. I'm one of the three co-conveners of the Synapse series, along with Bethwyn Evans, who's here, and Chris Ballard, who's not here, to be somewhere else. But the purpose of this series is to get conversations going about topics in the deep human past and about what makes human cultures so amazingly different from each other. Before going on, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the country of Ngunnawal people, and that this is country that has never been ceded. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to extend my respect to any other Indigenous people who are here today or listening remotely or to recording. It's very important that we continue to do this. So the introduction to Ben Shaw today, I'm going to hand over the process of doing that to Simon Haverley, our Director of CHL, and someone else who's played a central role in establishing the Evolution of Cultural Diversity initiative, which is linked to Synapse, but not the same thing. So Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for everybody complying with the mask wearing as well. It's great. Brave new world of seminars in this situation. So really, it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Ben Shaw. Ben arrived here last year in the middle of chaos, but what a wonderful appointment Ben has been, and it's really great privilege to have Ben here as part of our staff working on the Evolution of Cultural Diversity initiative, which, as many of you know, is something we're hopefully building on and expanding in the next few years. Ben's role in that has been really pivotal in terms of particularly his work in Papua New Guinea, where we'll hear some of that today, but his extensive work up in that region, and a region where I've worked closely with Ben as well on various projects. And I think part of what exemplifies what Ben does is this multidisciplinary approach to research, and bringing in other researchers into the conversation and into the analysis. You know, I've done pollen work for Ben on various excavations, and you know, it's always very rewarding, and it's always a really sort of strong collaboration that Ben is able to build up. And I think that is a very strong attribute, and particularly in the kind of work that Ben focuses on in archaeology, and not only Papua New Guinea, but at the Pacific and Australia, French Polynesia, areas like that. And of course, New Zealand, where he originally hails from. So yeah, it's really wonderful to see Ben here, and the kind of topic we're talking about today. And it's part of a bigger kind of research and teaching effort that Ben is embarking on. And as some of you may know, Ben is also going to be convening a field school, initially in Australia, in Victoria, in fact, in September, we hope. Fingers crossed. Victoria's doing remarkably well at the moment, so that's a good sign. But these endeavours, which we want to keep on developing and pushing, getting students out into the field, understanding not only fieldwork conditions, but working with communities, engaging with communities in their respectful way, is really important, and really can only be done out in the field. So again, Ben is leading the way in that aspect of what we're doing in CHL at the moment as well, and this particular initiative. So yeah, really welcome, Ben, and I'm really looking forward to hearing this talk. The title of the talk is Lapita-Papuan Interactions in New Guinea, Implications for Pacific Colonisation and Regional Social Histories. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Nick and Simon, and kia ora everyone. Thanks for coming along today, both in person and on Zoom. I can't see everyone there, but I hope you all can hear me. Yep, excellent. Firstly, I'd just like to extend the acknowledgement of country to those communities in New Guinea who I've been working with for the past several years, particularly on Brookeron Paniate, whose generosity and collaboration was pivotal in the research that is ongoing here. And so, although I'm up here talking, that is part of a large team that you see up here and many others that have contributed along the way, and I'd like to acknowledge them as well. So what I'll be broadly speaking about today is just part of some archaeological research that I've been undertaking for the past several years in the islands of Southeast New Guinea, what we call the Massim, which is at its core transdisciplinary and looking very broadly at how people have adapted to different island ecosystems over time as these ecosystems have changed, at least since the last ice age about 20,000 years ago. Today, over the next sort of 50 minutes or so, what I want to talk about is a subset of that, which is some new and developing evidence that we have in some of the excavations for interaction, very early interaction between Lapita and Papua cultural groups in southern New Guinea. And I'll be talking a bit about the implications for that very broadly, about models for social interaction in New Guinea and for people moving out into the Pacific for colonisation and the profound impact this had on regional social identities. The questions of Lapita and Papua interaction are certainly not new. These have been argued and modelled quite eloquently by a lot of researchers over a lot of years. But what's always been missing in this regard is direct evidence for it. And in this case, Lapita are those communities that derive from Southeast Asia, inhabited island New Guinea for several centuries, and then were the initial inhabitants of remote Oceania. And those of Papua were those that have been indigenous to the region for several millennia before their arrival. So what I want to demonstrate here is that although models have Lapita coming into the Bismarck archipelago and staying there for several centuries before moving out very quickly into the Western Pacific, those islands that had not been colonized before, I'll be arguing that they move very rapidly through many island and coastal landscapes, and there they encountered various populations in different island ecosystems. And based on the nature and extent of those interactions is some of the patterns that we see, and what I'll put forward is some evidence for the dynamics that led to what is a relatively structured social history in island New Guinea. So this is blocking the top half of it, but as you can see, I think the best place to start to really looking at some of these questions is from a global perspective. And certainly for the majority of the history of our species, Homo sapiens, they evolved and migrated and lived in a continental landmass across certainly various ecosystems, but continental nonetheless. Once we turn that globe around to the side a little bit, you get an idea as these sort of arrows fade away as to the extent of the Pacific region that we're talking about, spanning 1/3 of their surface, and it would seemingly be devoid of land. But we know that beginning about 3,000 years ago or slightly before, Lapita people were the first inhabitants of some of those islands, and then descendant communities reached some of the most far-flung and isolated land masses on Earth, getting out to Rapa Nui, Easter Island about 800 years ago, New Zealand and the Marquesas and Hawaii and other island groups, spanning 1/4 of their circumference essentially. Now, this was relatively rapid in human history, and it would have involved some innovative adaptations, both technologies and their behaviors, not only for these cultural groups to make these long sea voyages, but then to survive and thrive, as we know they did once reaching these far-flung islands. And what we're talking about is the beginning, essentially, of this long narrative back here in New Guinea. And of course, these adaptations and human migrations and the complexity of the social worlds that go behind that with both modern and past human societies in the Pacific are extraordinarily complex. And from an archaeological perspective, we have to try and connect what are these essentially voiceless pieces of rubbish in the ground to what is an overwhelming complex social world. And the only way we can do that is by connecting the dots beyond archaeology, which we fail in a lot of places to do. So we draw on evidence from anthropology and linguistics and other disciplines. And I think these images here really sort of contrast the dichotomy of what we're trying to do. On the left here is an image midway through a sort of an exchange on Russell Island, where I did my PhD. The man on the left is John Lamonga. The man on the right is offering him a turtle shell object. Midway through exchange, John was very unhappy with the nature of this exchange, thought that it wasn't fair for what was going on. Being out there watching this, I was completely lost on me, but there were a lot of different social negotiations that are at play, and obviously these objects are a key part of that. But to really bring out that story, we really need to work across disciplines. And in this context, when we're talking about Lapita, these cultural groups that came into New Guinea from Southeast Asia and moved out to the Pacific, we are moving forward talking about an archaeological culture, one that we only recognize from the remains that we have in the ground. There is no direct evidence for it as far as we know from oral history. Certainly if it does, it merges into mythology, but we do have very clear parallels with modern Pacific communities. And the material that we do find in the ground, again, has parallels that with some of the social systems that are used historically in many Pacific communities. So it is a complex mix of cultural elements that we're dealing with here, not only introduced from Southeast Asia, but many of which from interactions with indigenous populations over the several thousands of years that they've been living and moving through these different landscapes, including New Guinea. And as we know, they are associated with the spread of new languages into New Guinea called Austronesian, as well as genetic input from Southeast Asia. And again, this had a huge, profound input and change on the cultural development of communities there. And as with every cultural group and population in the world, past, present, and future, Lapita is no different to that in the sense that it's part of a continuously changing and very complex cultural landscape. Lapita is recognized here once they reach the islands of New Guinea and moving out into these uninhabited islands of the Pacific. But until they reach this black line here, which hopefully everyone can see the cursor, this is the demarcation between what we call near Oceania to the left and remote Oceania to the right. Before that, they were inhabiting landscapes that had been occupied by people for a very, very long period of time. And Lapita itself has a long history with migration of ancestral populations coming down from China into Taiwan, through the Philippines and out to Micronesia and along the north coast of New Guinea. Over the span of human history would seem quite rapid, but still took several thousand years for this to happen. And we can trace some similarities over this very long period of time in some of the decorative elements of pottery. These are agricultural populations that started producing pottery in these areas. So there are these new innovations in the cultural systems, but we do see innovations that are unique to the Pacific region, how we call it Lapita. Case in point here being the appearance of faces on some of these vessels. But certainly behind this very fragmented record are very complex systems of social worlds. And we're focusing here on this red dot. These are the Massim Islands, just below what is the core thrust of Lapita migration. We now know that the Massim is within this ambit of Lapita migration. And both of these landscapes to the north of Bismarck Archipelago been occupied in excess probably of 45,000 years. And from what we know so far down south in these fragmented islands, at least 17,000 years, probably longer. So we have an area where we can begin to model the interaction between all of these different island ecosystems to try and get an understanding about how these cultural groups are interacting with indigenous groups before they migrated out into these uninhabited islands of the Pacific, and starting off one of the greatest migrations in human history. By looking now at the distribution of Lapita, we can see that it's fairly structured in many ways, but you can see all these red dots demonstrate all of the Lapita sites that have been identified across the Western Pacific. The western border, as far as we know, is somewhere in mainland New Guinea, but certainly the earliest ones are up here in what we call the Bismarck Archipelago. That dates somewhere in the range of 3,300, perhaps up to 3.4 or 3.5. What we know about the distribution of the sites in this area is that they tended to be living primarily on the smaller offshore islands up in the north, not exclusively, but primarily. And we know that about 3,500 years ago, sea levels were slightly higher than they are today. So they'll be moving into these coastal environments with coastal beachfronts that are starting to develop and had not been inhabited before by Papuan populations. And as those beachfronts are migrating, their sediments are basically following that progression as the beachfront moves out. We know from decades of excellent detailed research on many archipelagos through the Pacific that there's a relative rapid migration of people out into beyond this line of near and remote Oceania, these uninhabited islands. It seems that the Solomons, in terms of Lapita at least, were occupied a lot later. We know people have been living there for at least 30,000 years. In terms of Lapita, somewhat later, coming up into Reef Santa Cruz, Vanuatu, New Caledonia from about 3100, and very quickly out to Fiji, and Samoa and Tonga was occupied by about 2,850 years ago. So relatively rapid. Since about 10 years ago, there's now very solid evidence for the migration of Lapita cultural groups along the south coast of New Guinea. It had long been suspected and argued by earlier researchers, but now confirmed, and with dates published of about 3,000 to 2,900. I'll argue a bit later on that perhaps this might have been a little bit later in time, perhaps a century or so. We're not talking about huge differences, but I'll discuss it a bit later on. And what we have here is a case that I'll be discussing here, where we have evidence of Papua-Lapita interaction, what I will call sort of frontiers of this very early expansion into new island ecosystems, as well as a previously published example up here between the Bismarcks and the Solomon Islands, which similarly are moving out of this early distribution of Lapita. And through these case studies, we can get some sense of what this interaction looked like and how it might have influenced later population dynamics in these regions, and ultimately dispersals into other areas. The problem that we have with the archaeology of New Guinea and all of these archipelagos, but particularly in southern New Guinea, is a lack of clarity in the archaeological records immediately before the arrival of Lapita cultural groups. And if we're going to model what interaction looks like, we need to have some understanding of what those earlier cultural groups look like. Can't see it, it's under this bar, at least in the room, but called this the enigmatic millennia. And you can see at this graph at the top that each one of these red dots is the calibrated radiocarbon dates for all of the archaeological sites in southern Papua New Guinea on the coast and in the Massim. And you can see that there's very good coverage going back to this hashed area here, which is essentially the age range for Lapita cultural complex in the area. But beyond this, very few dates at all. And this is somewhat problematic because we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest what these cultural groups are like. We do have a pulse of occupation here, suggesting that there's a lot of reorganization of how people are utilizing these landscapes in the last 5,000 years, certainly to do with stabilizing coastlines, but I suspect people are using these broader coastlines much differently than earlier in time. Most of these dates here that are encircled are from the site that I'll be discussing today, but in absence of more detailed archaeological evidence for cultural evidence immediately before Lapita, we have some of the brilliant work by researchers such as Pamela Swadling and Robin Torrance, who have done a great job of looking at the distribution of some formerly manufactured tools throughout New Guinea, including pestles and mortars, some of these intricate stone carvings here, and these remarkable obsidian blades. And these dots indicate the distribution of some of the pestles and mortars. They're certainly not suggesting that this is a single large social network, but the distribution of these objects is over a very large area that probably involved many, many different social networks that were occurring in the millennia before Lapita arrived into the region, probably 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Clusters in the highlands on coastal New Guinea, certainly out to the Bismarck archipelago, and of course down into the Massime area here, which we'll be discussing. Pam Swadling specifically noted that some of the pestles and mortars, which very strongly indicate that they're probably 3,000 to 4,000 years old. The decorative elements on these are very similar between here and down here, suggesting that there's some established maritime networks between these areas. And why that's important for this context is that there is a lot of evidence then for people moving out around within and between coastal and island environments, which would have some influence on how interaction might have played out. Now, zooming in now to the Massime region. So it's a scattering of islands off the eastern tip of New Guinea. It's a truly remarkable place in terms of just the sheer number of environments that are out there. And just lining up these pictures with the blue dots across the landscape, you can see that it's ecologically quite complex, with fjords and mountains that are a couple of thousand meters high, down to coral atolls that are just a couple of meters above sea level, uplifted limestone and active volcanic landscapes, all of which have had a profound influence on the cultural and linguistic and genetic diversity of the people that live there. Certainly in this area, there are dozens of languages they're very tightly clustered around some of these landscapes. But it's not just ecological diversity in here, it's very much a cultural and geographic crossroads for people today and in the past. For those that might be moving down the coast from the north or from the Bismarck archipelago and along the south coast, they'll be moving one way or another through these Massime Islands, at least along the coast. So it is an excellent place to look at interaction at different points in time. And we know through some of the modeling work of Laurent Dessau and Di Piazza that have been looking at sailing simulations based on wind direction and currents and sailing technology, that the Massime region is very centrally connected, or potentially very centrally connected, to a lot of islands around them. So again, setting the scene here for very complex and diverse social histories in this region that might involve interaction across larger areas. Before we just step into the archaeology and talk about some of the evidence that we've had over the past few years, I just want to talk a bit about the language distribution, which I think is very key to this puzzle, as it were. And what we see here is the distribution of Austronesian languages across island New Guinea, which, as I mentioned before, were very likely introduced by Lapita cultural groups some 3,400 years ago. And what we see here is that essentially Austronesian languages have more or less replaced through contact-induced change or some other mechanism the Papuan languages that were spoken in these areas before their arrival. So there must have been some level of charismatic or convincing diplomacy or otherwise involving these incoming cultural groups and their interactions with those that had been living in the area beforehand. It does follow the main thrust of Lapita expansion, being coastally and island orientated. There isn't a lot of penetration of these languages into the interior, which were very heavily populated. But I think in terms of when we're looking at the Massime and evidence for interaction, this paints, I think, a very important story about what might be the historical process of long-term interaction between various regions. For example, this cluster here of Austronesian languages follows what we now know to be the main thrust of Lapita expansion along the south coast, but there's no connection between those in the north and those in the south, broken up by communities along the coast that speak Papuan languages. And unlike other areas in New Britain and the Bismarck archipelago, there's no offshore islands. And certainly if there was not sustained interaction between the north and the south. We are picking this up in the archaeology, and certainly what's happening down south is somewhat different to what's occurring elsewhere in these archipelagos. I won't have time to go into the genetics, but this also tells a very fascinating story about some of the population structuring through admixture and intermarriage over thousands of years in this area, particularly down here in the Calvados, Louisiana archipelago. We will be looking at the archaeology that suggests that even though there's been complete replacement by Austronesian languages, both the maternal and paternal evidence from the genetics suggests that it's predominantly Papuan admixture still, so some structure. And on top of that, we have one little island at the very end of Massime, which still speaks Papuan language. So it attests that there's a very complex history of people moving in and some isolation where populations held on to their language. This is very complex and it's not related to anything else. So it is indeed a complex history. Where we chose to work for the archaeology was primarily in this island chain called the Calvados. And this was a fascinating place to work because it allowed us to directly contrast and compare archaeological sequences between islands. And so we could trace the nature of interaction and occupation over a long period of time. And what is, 130-kilometer chain of islands, they're all closely spaced together, so very easy to get from one to the other and somewhat of a voyaging corridor. And within the surrounding it is this incredibly diverse lagoon reef system, which is very beneficial in the focus of a lot of the subsistence for the people living on these islands. If we look here just to the left, this edge of the lagoon would have been the former coastline some 14,000 years ago when sea levels were a lot lower. And this would have formed a single 8,000-kilometer island. Across this island chain as well, it's geologically varied based on the nature of its history, being on the edge of a subduction plate. So a lot of it's tilting and swaying in different directions. We have limestone islands over here, Brooker, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, is volcanic. And then we get down to various schist islands. And this I'll argue a bit down the track is a reason why we're finding such comprehensive evidence on this island. A lot of the islands are quite steep in terms of their coastline, so we didn't have a lot of options of finding long-term cultural evidence. That just wouldn't be on most of these islands. So we chose one that was on the very western edge. The reason for that is because it's just a natural entry point into these island chains for anyone that's coming through this area. It's very hard to avoid. It's also a very sheltered area. This island pretty much looks like a big W. It's got two large bays, north facing, and these little promontories here shelter it very well from the wind, and the reef around it shelters it from the strong ocean currents that are breaking across it. So just a beautiful place to live. And within this, we chose this valley here because it had most of the conditions that were necessary for the preservation of long-term cultural occupation. And unfortunately, again, it's blocking the top, but welcome to Brooker Island. This is where we spent a lot of time over the last, not the last 3 years, 2017 to 19. And it was just a brilliant place to work. The communities here, there's about 400 odd people on the island, but the island is very small. I mean, you could walk around it in a few hours at quite a leisurely pace. Very low lying too, which is a problem for rain and permanent fresh water. Doesn't capture the cloud as well as the higher elevated islands elsewhere in the archipelago. So drought is a constant problem for the population here, and it certainly would be for people that would have been living here in the past when a few thousand years ago the sea levels were a little bit higher than they are today. Certainly with climate change, their aquifers and wells that they rely on becoming more salty, so they're on the verge of hopefully not an ecological problem. So again, we focused on it. We surveyed the entire island, but in 2017, we had unfortunately spent a little bit too long finishing off an excavation at the other end of the island chain. We only had about 3 days to start the work on here, having spent a lot of time already speaking with the communities who were very engaged with the research. But fortunately, after those 3 days, we found what we were hoping to find, which was evidence for these Lapita cultural groups in the Massaim. And it was the first definitive evidence that we had for them being in this island group in the form of distinctively decorated pottery, and the first pottery that we find introduced into this region. So focusing on this bay, we just worked backwards to try and characterize the nature of the deposit, and found that there was quite a dense cultural deposit going back with evidence prior to Lapita and evidence of a buried coral reef. So it was quite evident that people had been living on this beach basically as soon as it had started forming, as is the case in many other parts of New Guinea. Now, given the size of the population on this island and the small size of the island itself, it's surprising that there's not many people living here, but this is essentially the island's pantry, and it made it for a beautiful place to work in amongst the banana trees and coconut trees and garden groves. And this enabled us to really expand out when we needed to get that resolution to really define the cultural sequence over the last few thousand years, which has been really lacking in this part of the Pacific. Prior to this, we had good records, maybe going back 1,500 years. So before this, it was a complete mystery. We opened up 4 square meters to control the depth in the water, which we inevitably encountered being so close to the sea, and those dreaded rainfalls just before we arrived. So we spent a long time behind the buckets just to clear it out. As one of the locals said, he goes, I liked the work, but I didn't love it. But we ended up celebrating at the end, and we didn't quite get to the bottom of the cultural deposit, but we felt we were close enough to, well, we couldn't go any further for safety reasons, but we've got a very nicely stratified and well preserved and defined cultural sequence, which is wonderful. And what we were able to do with some of the radiocarbon labs, particularly and primarily with the new one that's been set up, the Kronos lab at UNSW, with Chris and Lorena, was to develop a really highly resolved chronology based on, it's under this thing here, but I think 37 charcoal samples we took and got about 22 dates back. But the resolution on these were just extraordinary. We're talking plus or minus 9 to 12 years. And putting all those together, we could distinguish cultural elements within the sequence. But looking first and foremost at the pottery distribution through here, it tells quite a vivid story of what's going on. And we could trace this back through the nature of the pottery assemblage, varying concentrations based on this blue line, very little pottery at the top associated with regional traditions. And for most of this deposit, we've got about 150 centimeters of Lapita occupation, which is very clearly associated with this distinctive dentate stamp pottery. Below here, we had a very hard border between layer 5 and 6, where we have no pottery at all. And this is the interesting deposit that we came down upon. But in terms of the dating, we had very secure dates going back to about 4,400 years in the lowest layer. And within layer 6, which is the one that we're primarily concerned with here, we've got dates that go back for about 3,600 to about 3,000, but really centered around that 3,300 to 3,200 range, which is coincident in time with some of the earliest arrival of Lapita sites elsewhere in the Pacific. Above that, with the introduction, or very clear introduction, of late Lapita pottery, very much later in the sequence, we've got a great bunch of dates that clarify occupation starting at 2,750 and going back to about 2,350. One outlier here, which is a bit older, but otherwise very secure, which matches up very nicely with the pottery that we have. And then some later occupation in time going the last couple of thousand years, which matches up very nicely with the pottery. So we've got a very detailed sequence that quite clearly distinguished. Looking at the obsidian, it tells a very different but important story compared to the pottery. What this demonstrates, again with the blue line, is that different concentrations of obsidian throughout the Lapita deposit, but very importantly, where the pottery stops, the obsidian doesn't, which we have evidence of obsidian exploitation, which is not local to the island, that we can reconstruct some of the social networks for this time period. And the bone, which again tells a very fascinating story with very little bone at the top, consistent all the way through the Lapita deposit, but very, very dense in this layer 6 associated with this slightly earlier time period going back 3,600 to 3,000 years. What this tells us is that there was very little bone in the bottom here, very much peaking in this layer 6. We have evidence for a change of how people are using this island and exploiting the faunal resources, the animal resources on this island. So we really want to clarify this boundary between these two contexts so we can distinguish between Lapita cultural groups arriving much, much later in time and permanently residing on this island and having a huge impact on the local environment, presumably when they cleared the hillside from behind them for gardening, and all of the soil came down and built up on top of it. And underneath this here, we have basically the beach sands. And we really did have this layer boundary was between two different worlds. At the bottom here, we had, again, all the soil coming down from the side of the hill. All of these are naturally occurring rocks that they've just positioned deliberately to form what seemed to be deliberate paths. We had no downward movement of pottery, as you saw in that graph, but all the pottery lying on the bottom of this layer, which is just after the introduction of pottery, were lying flat, suggesting exposed cultural surface with no significant post-depositional disturbance. No layers, no Lapita dates below this layer, and the material indicates a very clear change in behavior, as we saw from those earlier graphs. And what we found was when Stuart Hawkins, who's a bone guru from here at ANU, went through all of the individual bone remains that we were found from the site, characterizing the fish and so forth, found a number of introductions from the lowest cultural deposit, primarily pig and dog, very low down in this deposit, cuscus, a type of possum, and possibly rat, which were introduced somewhere between probably 3,300 years ago. The important thing about this is that elsewhere in the Pacific, they're very clearly Lapita introductions, these animals. And the presence here is somewhat complexing because it's very clearly not associated with pottery. And every other single Lapita site we have in the Pacific is associated with pottery. So we have something else going on here that we need to explain. There are some suggestions of earlier introductions of particularly pig into New Guinea, but not empirically supported. And certainly in this part of New Guinea, which is a long way from the introduction routes from Southeast Asia where pigs would have come from, the context here is very clearly contemporary with the earliest Lapita arrivals. So with the lack of pottery and the introduction of these Lapita domesticates, we have a couple of mechanisms that we can explore that might explain what's going on here. And two that I would argue would either be direct, and that is small, relatively mobile groups of people with part of the Lapita cultural complex were moving very rapidly once they arrived into the Pacific region, down south into the Massim Islands here, which are hundreds of kilometers south, and were residing in the islands themselves. These were probably quite small groups before large settlements had been established and local production of pottery had begun, which we see, say, for example, up in those early settlements in the Bismarck Archipelago. Equally as plausible is the indirect route, which, of course, this population that are living on this island 3,600 or so thousand years ago were Papuan populations, and they were getting these Lapita animals, these introductions through existing social networks because they were probably socially valuable from Lapita groups that were living elsewhere, either in the region or elsewhere in New Guinea. And I would argue that it's probably likely that there were Lapita settlements elsewhere the Massim, given the huge distances otherwise that these animals would have had to have traveled to get there. And why no pottery? Well, we know that in many parts of New Guinea that pottery was rejected by populations not associated with Lapita. It's not necessarily a socially valuable or necessary item. So detecting interaction in different island ecosystems between what would be Lapita associated with pottery and Papuans that are indigenous to the area might be not as readily as identified, because we might not be seeing a complete change in the cultural record that we might expect. But we're not just seeing the arrival of some objects coming into a pre-existing population. We are seeing a very marked change in how this island is being used at exactly the same time, which is the interesting thing about this record. So as you saw in that preliminary graph, we've got dense turtle bone down the bottom, in clear association with this same context with the introduction of dog and pig. We have 17 times more bone by volume than in the entire Lapita deposit above it. This is a huge change in how this animal has been exploited, and it's much denser than deposits that are below it. So very clear intensity in island use, and this is reminiscent of islands in the remote Pacific that have never had a human population on it before, and is akin to something of like a colonisation movement. But because we know that there were already people on the island, there's a change in the dynamics of how people are using that landscape. We also have a change in technology relating to the turtle bone itself. The shell or the carapace had been found, a number of them have been broken, cut or flaked essentially into these rectangular tabs, and evidence for local production down into these sort of triangular tools using the natural morphology of the turtle shell itself to make some points for whatever reason, which are kind of reminiscent of these ethnographic examples. Now, this could be, of course, technology made by the population that was already living on the island, but the only correlate we have for this kind of technology is from colonizing Lapita sites. For this example here at Tayuma in Vanuatu, when people were first arriving, Lapita cultural groups first arriving on this island and exploiting these dense turtle populations. So there's certainly something going on in terms of the exploitation. And if people were coming for the turtle, and they may have been attracted to the island because there was a nesting turtle population, they were certainly staying for the fish. And I think the fish bone tells a pretty exciting story, not just about the exploitation, but it shows a similar pattern that is very dense. It's kind of, again, hidden by this, but at least twice as dense in the same context as the animal introductions associated with Lapita, the pig and the dog, than both overlying Lapita contexts or earlier contexts. What they were catching tells an interesting story about the ecology. Of the 13 fish families that Stuart Hawkins identified, the majority of them were herbivorous fish that lived on the reef, which means that for the last 4,500 years, we know that a reef was surrounding this island. And so a reef had formed relatively early once sea levels had started to stabilize. So again, in other parts of the Massim, this might not have been the case, but it would have made it more conducive for early populations to move into this particular part of the island chain because of this ecological diversity. And because these are herbivorous fish, they were probably netted or spears rather than baited, which have similar fish catch sort of patterns as historic and bottom netting behavior on the island. I'll just talk briefly about the obsidian, which I think again tells an interesting story about the social networks that were connecting this particular island, Brooker, with the wider region, and that is the use of obsidian, volcanic glass, which, as I mentioned earlier, is non-local to the island, but is found on one island about 300 kilometers to the west up here on Ferguson. And throughout the deposit, there's very big concentrations, and this technology here is quite remarkable. We've got very large blades. Some of them have been retouched into fine points, like up on this example here, which is probably either for tattooing or for at least skin piercing. And deliberate manufacture of other points and scrapers that might have been used to process food or for a number of different functions. Large pieces in the earlier context too, but through chemical sourcing, we know that all of this obsidian came from within the region, about 300 km to the west. What's interesting about this is when you compare the chemical results from layer 6, which are associated with these introductions of pig and dog, with the later Lapita layers, we have the exploitation of a different subsource, which is not occurring later in time. So we have different interactions occurring earlier and expansion of those social networks later in time. And from looking at the weight range of the obsidian throughout the sequence by layer, layer 6 down the bottom here is our one that dates between 3.5 and 3,000 years. And this is the Lapita deposit here, layers 3 to 5B. We can see that the weight ranges are extremely large. What this probably tells us is that, and then there's an exponential decrease later in time. And this is the last couple of thousand years, and this is probably the last 500. These large pieces in the earlier context tell us that there's a change in acquisition strategy. And very early on, from as early as 3,500 years ago, there's probably more regular movement throughout these islands, certainly between Ferguson Island, 300 kilometers to the west, and Brooker, suggesting that when there was likely Papuan populations or the introduction of Lapita cultural groups into the area, there was regular maritime transport, as we sort of suggested based on the work of Pam Swadling and Robin Torrance. Later in time, this exponential decrease is probably people becoming more sedentary in the archipelago and not interacting across such large distances. And these kind of results are replicated between many of the islands in the Massim and along the south coast. In fact, Lachlan's working on some obsidian from a neighboring island from these contexts here, and it very much matches that pattern. Finally, just looking at the stone technology as evidence of whether we have an introduction of a Lapita cultural group very early on, or what the nature of this interaction might look like. Except for obsidian, all of the stone found on the island that were culturally used was fairly locally sourced within the archipelago, probably within 40 or 50 kilometers. What's most remarkable is that we found at the very bottom of this layer 6 deposit, associated with the pig and the dog and these other cultural elements, suggesting a change in the intensity of island use, is this remarkable axe or adze made from a chlorite schist, probably nearby. When we compare it with Lapita adzes or part thereof, these are all polished and ground and either broken in manufacture or broken during reuse. You can see that the shape has changed quite significantly from essentially a lenticular, triangular shape to one that is sort of planilateral, which is essentially rectangular in shape, which is quite common in Lapita assemblages and certainly is reminiscent of axes that are found along the south coast, also in Lapita context. So it looks like that we might have a change in manufacturing style based on cultural influences to the island. Not to say that this is a huge regional tradition, but we do see these axes made later in time in the same island groups. And so we've probably got cultural elements of both incoming Lapita groups and earlier ones continuing onwards, as well as evidence for local manufacture. And once we have the introduction of pottery in the above layers from about 2,750, it's as clear as day. These are all looking like tattoo designs, distinctly decorated. We call it dentate stamped, and very characteristic of Lapita pottery. Most of them are very badly eroded, which is why I'm showing them as these drawings rather than the actual sherds themselves. And to demonstrate that this is probably part of a relatively rapid movement of Lapita through from the Bismarck archipelago south and along the south coast of New Guinea, is that the motifs that we find on the pottery are also found up here in Western Britain in later Lapita contexts and in contemporary settlements along the south coast, suggesting that the symbolic nature of the pottery that was used by the people that were transporting them was occurring very, very rapidly. So now we've got a number of lines of evidence that suggest that we've got introductions without the presence of pottery. We've got a marked change in the way that the landscape has been used that indicates that there is either a change in population density or increased movement of people through this archipelago 3,500 to 3,000 years ago. What's really remarkable is that this was here in the first place. We just weren't expecting it. So the further down we dug and the more we found, it was just quite complexing at the start. And I think what explains this quite well is if we contrast this directly with the excavations we did at the other end of the archipelago. So this is Brooker, where we've been talking about now, about 130 odd k's to the other end is Samoa. And what we have here are comparative island sequences that show island or beach formation. And again, very highly resolved, but it shows down here at the very bottom where the beach is forming was only about 2,500 years old, which is about 2,000 years shy of what we're finding just up the island chain. And what seems to be going on is that this localized uplift of islands is impacting when beach frontages are forming very early on. Some geological work that was done here on lithified beach deposits indicate that these were uplifted above modern sea level about 3,500 years ago, and combined with some island uplift here and a bit of tilting on the south coast of Brooker, suggests that as these islands were probably uplifted early on, they're all starting to sink now very, very slowly, that the beach formed and nesting populations of turtles probably started going to that island, followed very early on by people. So we have these kind of salubrious coastlines that would have attracted people to these island landscapes much, much earlier in time. So we have this unique example of both early occupation and perhaps early interaction between Lapita and Papua populations in a rather unique island landscape. And before I sort of get into the final sort of conclusions here, I just want to mention this other case study that I referred to at the start, which is on Nissen Island. And this is again on an important area midway between the Bismarck Archipelago, where this blue star is, and the start of the Solomon Island chain. So it was on the outskirts of, based on models, what was the earliest distribution of Lapita in the Pacific. What was found here by Matthew Spriggs as part of the Lapita Homeland Project in the mid-80s, it was directly looking for long-term sequences of occupation to characterize exactly this kind of problem. How are Lapita populations coming in and interacting with indigenous cultural groups, and how did that influence later dispersals? What he found was a pattern that was exactly reminiscent of what we've got on Guntuka. And here, if we look down here at the pottery and obsidian concentrations, we've got high pottery and obsidian in the top layers, very clearly associated with Lapita, and aceramic below that. But what we have is a number of shell artifacts that are reminiscent of a Lapita toolkit, as it was argued by Matthew Spriggs when it was published. On top of that, however, in this lower aceramic, before the introduction of pottery, we've got high concentrations of both shell and bone, including the introduction of pigs, like we have on Brooker Island and Guntuka. And this was initially defined as Lapita without pots, and it's been somewhat enigmatic as a record, with very few or no other records that were comparable to this. So it didn't quite fit within the models, and it was sort of on the outskirts of these models since that time. But what was sort of certainly suggested is that there's early Lapita contact on the outskirts of this early distribution, or indeed, as I've been arguing here, for the bringing in of Lapita cultural objects through existing social networks by Papuan populations. And I would argue that both down here in the Massime, this black box, and Nissen between the Solomons were representing frontiers of these early Lapita expansions, as they were not just staying within the Bismarck archipelago, but were moving very rapidly into a number of different island and coastal environments and encountering different concentrations of people. But the social negotiations involved with that would be markedly different depending on who and how they encountered. And this ultimately, I think, influenced the nature and direction and structure of migrations. And so I think best to look at this at quite a broad scale and to sort of sum up the regional evidence that we have here. If we look at this graph at the top here, what this is essentially showing is calibrated radiocarbon dates for red being charcoal, blue for shell. The black bars are the associated eras, and the sites are on the names of the sites are on the side here. The yellow highlight are those ranges that are associated with Lapita occupation, and these are essentially the earliest recognized Lapita sites that we have in New Guinea, dating somewhere in the order of 3,300 years ago, maybe slightly earlier. And it correlates very well in the Bismarck archipelago to the north with this cataclysmic eruption of Mount Watori that we see here as this hashed line, somewhere between 3,500 to 3,200 years. So in the Bismarck archipelago, we have something entirely different going on, and that is a very active volcanic landscape. And this would just suggest to me that Lapita were probably already in this area and taking advantage of this eruption that, as it's been argued elsewhere, may have depopulated or changed the sediment dynamics of parts of these coastal and island areas, and Lapita were able to move in. What's evident here is that there's no prior settlement in these locations before Lapita occupation. If we look elsewhere in the same archipelago, on other offshore island groups, we do see evidence of slightly later Lapita occupation, highlighted again in yellow, but we also have very significant evidence for earlier occupation, essentially as soon as beachfront development had occurred. These yellow dots up here are direct coral dates suggesting people were on these landscapes as soon as they had formed, but there's no continued occupation up until Lapita. So we had no idea what this kind of interaction would look like and how it might have been influencing sediment dynamics and later migrations and dispersals in the area. Then if we add in the sites that were discussed today, Guntuka on Brooker Island, we can see that this evidence that we have for this earlier interaction between Lapita and Papua people is directly coincident with the earliest Lapita sites in the Pacific, this green box here. If we add this in with the Banghalika, which is the other frontier site that I mentioned, excavated by Matthew Spriggs, also argued to be early interaction, perhaps even slightly earlier, but with some continuity. These are rather unique landscapes, which again, I'd argue would be frontiers with this evidence of direct interaction, but not complete transmission of a complete cultural package with the introduction of pottery. And then just some representative examples of the colonization of those islands that had not been inhabited before. Just after about 3,100 years ago, Santa Cruz and Vanuatu, those first land masses that they would have encountered, moving all the way through to the east at Tonga, where we have radiocarbon and these beautifully highly resolved uranium thorium chronologies, putting first landfall about 2,850. What's interesting here is when we compare this with what we have for cultural sequences of Lapita arrival on the south coast of New Guinea and the Massime. These sites have just been published and discovered in the last 10 or 12 years or so, and we have a fairly rapid migration throughout the region. I've highlighted a few dates here in orange, and there's a couple of different scenarios here, I think. These early dates of what have been characterized as the beginning of Lapita on the south coast, and then we have a fairly rapid migration throughout the region. I've highlighted a few dates here in orange, and there's a couple of different scenarios here, I think. These early dates of what have been characterized as the beginning of Lapita on the south coast, And I think there's a very distinct possibility that these are actually characterizing indigenous occupation of these landscapes immediately before Lapita arrival. For example, at Tanamu 1, this date is out of sequence with all the other dates in the same context. And these dates here, there's a large gap between them, and this is from the bottom of the layer, so it might be immediately prior. Regardless, what we see at most sites is relatively rapid migration through the area after about 2,800, 2,750, and then less intensive exchange out through to the Gulf of Papua, represented by the Hopo site, and out into the Torres Strait. And so this is probably best seen graphically to sort of sum up the results so far, is that we see about 3,300 years ago, rapid migration, not only into the Bismarck archipelago as has been modeled, but all through basically at all compass points along the coastal and island areas of New Guinea. Of course, people didn't have a map of the Pacific. They didn't know where islands were and were not. And so they probably took off to the north, off to the east, and certainly down to the south into the Massime, where they encountered different island ecosystems, different populations. And I would argue that we had a lot of frontier, for lack of a better word, contacts in these areas that were probably quite hard to detect because it didn't always involve the full-scale introduction of pottery, which probably came after the establishment of permanent settlements, which we do see in the Bismarck archipelago. And because of differences between all of these archipelagos in terms of the population dynamics of both the indigenous population and those ones moving in, slightly higher sea levels than today, some being very active volcanic landscapes, would have profoundly influenced the social process of contact. But we certainly do see establishment of larger settlements in the north and perhaps not so much down in the south. And as we may have demonstrated with the Kuntuka site, that pottery may have been rejected by these Papuan groups, which was introduced probably through Papuan social networks. So I'd argue that the relatively rapid sudden migration out into the Eastern Pacific was not just out of the blue. It probably involved migrations and interactions of Lapita populations in all parts of coastal areas, but that migrations further out to the east showed particular promise and across over intergenerational sort of time. These attempts, as they proved more successful, they gained a lot more traction. We see the rapid migrations that we see into the uncolonized islands of the Pacific. So these clearly influence social decisions, as I would argue. Coasting the Solomon Islands, as the archaeological record suggests, and certainly two-way voyaging, even though they reach Vanuatu, and there's thousands of kilometers between here and the Bismarck archipelago, where they probably left from. We do see the continual movement of goods across this huge area, particularly of obsidian. Interestingly, however, we do have a few pieces of obsidian from the Massime arriving in Reef Center Cruise in Vanuatu. And this may be because of those very early pathways that Lapita made down into the south. Once Lapita expanded as far east as they could, and undoubtedly they probably tried to continue to keep moving. Again, they didn't have a map of the Pacific. Movements were made back into these heavily occupied areas, perhaps of the Solomons, as has been argued by Peter Shepherd and Matt Felgate and others. We have all of a sudden Lapita occupation in the Solomons from about 2,800. We've got movement through the Massime along the south coast very rapidly, certainly after 2,900 years, but mainly after 2,800, as well as all of a sudden the trade of pottery from the coast at around the same time. So the population dynamics of these mass diasporas had changed and had focused very much on occupied landscapes. And I would argue that what we know very little, admittedly, about the genetics of the people that moved out into the Pacific is that there seemed to be little admixture or intermarriage between indigenous populations. Certainly by 2,800 years, genetic and biological anthropology analyses indicate that there was increased amount of admixture. So this increased amount of interaction between populations may have broken down clan boundaries. There might have been more familial contacts, perhaps to the point where the term Lapita people is no longer valid, because we're essentially dealing with a single population or different cultural traditions, as Lapita is really used to characterize. And then we see less intensive movement up into the Gulf through the Torres Strait and potentially further afield into Australia. Knowing what we know about the archaeology of the Gulf and the Torres Strait, it's probably going to be very low density, but may have formed the antecedent forms of the coral sea interaction sphere that folks such as Ian McNiffin have done such an excellent job of modelling. So I'd argue that the migrations were influenced by these earlier contacts, which encouraged people to move out east, and then later on through already settled landscapes. So then what are we missing? If we're looking at Lapita-Papuan interaction and these earlier dispersals into occupied landscapes, and we're not seeing necessarily the introduction of pottery with this, what are we missing in the archaeological records to tell this very nuanced story of a social complex world? Certainly there's not a lot of continuous occupation leading up into Lapita and near Oceania, but we don't see these patterns in those islands such as Vanuatu that haven't been colonized before. We always see the wholesale movement and establishment of settlements, the introduction of pottery, and the whole cultural complex associated with Lapita. So it is related, it seems, to incumbent populations of Papuans. And so what can we learn by investigating the social behavior between the archipelagos near Oceania, being the Massim, the Bismarcks, and the Solomon Islands moving forward, if pottery may not be the prime identifying object in the archaeological record? So I will leave it there. I'll probably talk for too long. Thank you very much. Aotearoa.